Namaste, I'm Raj Vedam. I'm speaking to you from Houston, Texas. At the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to give this address. And I'd also like to apologize for not being there in person. I couldn't travel thanks to the travel situation at this time, and therefore this offline presentation. So today I'd like to talk about culture as a knowledge continuum. I'd like to present a civilizational framework for understanding the Indian culture. Before I start, Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha, my pranams to hundreds of teachers whose works have enlightened us. A quick overview of today's presentation. I'm going to define India culture itself, and from there I'll go to the dimensions of Indian culture, which includes knowledge systems, social institutions, ethics, arts, and so on. Then I'll go to how the West defines culture. We'll talk about deracination and Western universalism, the resilient Vedic culture. We'll talk about contemporary influences and how we can strengthen and recover our culture today. So, first, we'd like to present culture as a knowledge continuum. For that, we should first start by defining what is culture. Well, Swamiji put it very nicely when he said, when a group of people live together for a long time in a particular geographical area, living certain values, the special fragrance that emanates from that group is said to be their culture. What a beautiful way of putting what culture is. Now we can formally ask, what is the etymology of this word culture? Well, culture is a cognate with the ancient Sanskrit word kulachar. Kulachar stands for conduct of a lineage with a root meaning of turning or moving. So we see that Latin got this word colliere related to kulachar, which had an agricultural meaning of cultivate the land. This eventually became the word cultura by the 15th century. During the European Enlightenment era, 17th to 18th century, Thomas Hobbes, he used the English word culture as a metaphor to plow the human mind. And this has got the modern English meaning of culture, which today is equated with civilized or refined behavior. It brings it closer to its Sanskrit root. So, a working definition of culture can be seen as a corpus of shared values, beliefs, morals, ethics, symbols, language, knowledge, artifacts, and so on. And this includes both tangible and intangible items, things like material things like tools, clothing, paintings, and non material things like ideas, music, customs, philosophies, and so on. We also note that culture is not static. Culture is dynamic and it evolves over time. We see that in addition over here. So, given that our premise is that culture is a knowledge continuum of the civilization, in this framework, we're going to see culture as knowledge plus the worldview plus the practices of that civilization, which is sustained over many centuries. In the Bharatiya context, we can see in knowledge systems which include scientific, philosophical, artistic, ethical knowledge, and so on, in the worldview itself, which is the cosmological framework, for example, and how we understand time, reality, causality, and so on. And the practices, for example, how we live through these values. For example, the festivals that we have, the rituals, the arts, the institutions, and the daily conduct, and so on. So we see culture is a living mechanism to encode, preserve, and to transmit civilizational understanding. So given that a culture is being defined as a knowledge continuum, we can ask what are the dimensions of Indian culture? In other words, can we study Indian culture in these categories? And I've identified 8 categories over here for Indian culture or Samskriti, which includes the worldview, knowledge and sciences, institution, ethics and values, aesthetic and arts, economics and technology, the transmission mechanisms for this knowledge system, and the collective memory that the civilization has over many, many years, centuries, and thousands of years, literally, that talk about these things. So, When we talk about the cultural dimensions, the first dimension I'd like to talk about is a worldview and cosmology. The key insight is Indians saw recurrent creation and destruction cycles with an infinite universe and an understanding of causality. We see, for example, in Surya Siddhanta, that time is measured from a fraction of a second, like, for example, Triti over here, to billions of years. And Surya Siddhanta, for example, talks about these things. In concepts of time or cosmological cycles, the civilization has evolved Chaturyuga, Kalpas, Manvantaras, which are huge temporal scales. Astronomy has been used as a celestial clock with timekeeping and for everyday calendrical use. So we see that we have a highly refined and calibrated approach to everyday life, very, very regulated with a deep appreciation of time and causal effects. So we see cosmology underpins our ethics, ecology, social organization, our way of life itself. And metaphysics is integrated into daily life. It is not separated from science. Throughout this presentation, I'm also going to give you a contrast with the European culture just to show the differences between Bharatiya culture and how the Europeans saw their own culture. In the Western culture, in contrast, we see that they define time with a beginning, with a divinity that makes a creation event, and the divinity that causes an apocalypse or an end event. So time begins and ends, which is in a contrast with how the Bharatiya people saw time itself in huge recurrent cycles. The second culture dimension we can see is knowledge systems and sciences. And the key insight here is that science was not separated from culture. It was deeply integrated into everyday practice. Indian knowledge systems we know has evolved in so many areas. I've just put a few here: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and several other sciences lumped over here. In mathematics, amazing things like place value, decimal systems, zero. One cannot overstate the importance of this in our modern technological society. The Silva Sutras that start with geometry and go on to geometrical algebra and so on. And mathematicians all the way from ancient times through Madhava the second, Bhaskara the second through Madhava, talking about calculus, algebra, and so on, combinatorics and Aryabhata's Kutuka algorithm. We see there's an enormous amount of mathematical knowledge development in the civilization, which has formed a part of culture, because mathematics is not studied as a pure mathematics for its own sake, but is applied in daily life, in practice, and so on. That is why it forms part of the cultural retinue of things that we have. In astronomy, we see, for example, in Aryabhatiya, we see planetary models. In Surya Siddhanta, we see celestial computations, calendar systems, very, very accurate orbital periods. In medicine, Ayurveda with holistic health systems. Shushruta talks about surgical techniques, Charaka Samhita with internal medicine, Vagbhata with preventive health. In metallurgy, iron smelting, now it has been discovered in Tamil Nadu from 3000 BCE, more than 5000 years ago. We're seeing linguistics and Panini's grammar, ecology in the Pancha Mahabhuta, the worldview looking at ecology in that sense, maritime navigation, which talks about shipbuilding technologies and so on. In contrast to the deep development and practice of the sciences, we see that in the Western culture, science has always been in conflict with their dominant ideas. That is why it required secularization, where science could be studied independently and religion and culture have been removed away from it. But we have not had such a stress at all in the Indian context. The third dimension of culture is that of institutions and social organization. This goes to the root of how the society itself behaves. The key insight is social institutions evolved, ensuring stability in terms of economics, in terms of well-being, purpose, and so on. We are seeing Shreni or the guilds, mathas, gurukulas, family systems, and several other social organizations. For example, merchant guilds, traders, artisans, they regulated aspects of industry, Wealth was reinvested in public works like building temples, tanks, infrastructure. So it goes back to help society. And mathas were monastic institutions which functioned as universities, generation of philosophical knowledge, teacher disciple transmission mechanisms. They served as centers of learning and debate. Gurukulas were residential schools in a teacher's household. They imparted holistic education in scripture, science, arts. They helped in character formation alongside academics and served as decentralized knowledge creation centers. Now, the family system itself, that is also important. The extended family or the joint family as a social bedrock of the civilization. Helped in preservation of cultural memory, daily ritual practices, and intergenerational knowledge transfer. In contrast, in the Western civilization, we are seeing feudal structures, which is basically the church and the nobility that controlled the peasants and others. They dominated Europe until the 18th to 19th century. And in order to preserve their power structures, they stifled knowledge institutions. So knowledge could not take hold in that civilization because of these issues. In the fourth dimension of culture, we can see ethics and values. We are seeing a dharmic framework, for example. The key insight is dharmic systems provided the intellectual framework for practical, ethical living, and very important for our times today, ecological harmony. Now, Dharma provided the framework for ethical action, binding individual duties, social harmony, cosmic order. Ahimsa, we know non-violence, the foundational ethical principle. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world is one family, again a universal ethical vision. Karma, the law of cause and effect, dignifying every action as spiritually significant. And Rhythm or Satya, cosmic truth and natural order underlying all existence. The Panchamahabhuta reverence, this was sacred ecology, the five elements as foundation for sustainable living. In contrast, we see Western culture. This tries to the present day to exploit and control nature, seeing it as divinely permitted in order to do such kind of exploitation. The fifth cultural dimension is that of aesthetics and artistic expression. Here is the key insight is art is not mere entertainment. It is embodied cosmology. Temple architecture, for example, that has encoded Vastu, that has got sacred geometry, symmetry, resonance, and astronomical alignment, which is embedded in every temple. When we take music, raga and thala, for example, there are mathematical structures encoding music. Each raga is associated with the time of the day, season, and mode. Natya Shastra, unified framework integrating aesthetics, psychology, geometry, acoustics, ethics into one single system. The literature, we have a vast corpus of works from Vedic hymns to epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, which encode civilizational wisdom. So we are seeing that in this dimension, India's got enormous riches to talk about. In contrast, we are seeing Western art. It was historically weaponized to impose racial superiority attitudes to the present day with its classical music or art forms that started with the Renaissance and so on. These were seen as class barriers. In the next dimension, cultural dimension, we are seeing economics and technology because what is a society if it is not economically strong, if it doesn't have technology? We can rely on the works of Angus Madison, who says in the 1500s, India had more than 25% of the world's GDP versus Europe at that time at less than 15%. So we are seeing at the onset of colonial rule, this is the kind of wealth that our ancestors had. And we can look at their economic and technological achievements. In agriculture, because of the regularity of the monsoons, one could plan very well and had well developed farming systems. Metallurgy, already talked about it, iron smelting from 3000 BCE, and the invention of high carbon steel that served enormous purposes and strength of tools and so on. Textiles, artisans were skilled in the art of fine muslin, dyeing techniques, as well as having global demand for Indian linen, muslin, and so on. Merchants had maritime trade, which implies shipbuilding and all kinds of things, and with networks, extending from east to Southeast Asia and west to Arabia as far as Rome. And we had the development of urban centers in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, for example, in the south to Kiradi, to Arikamedu and others, which show advanced city planning. We had several cottage industries with widespread decentralized artisanal production. In contrast to the economic activity that we are seeing in India, we are seeing that following the fall of the Roman Empire and the onset of Dark Ages, Europe was stifled by feudal structures, and this limited commercial activity till the onset of industrialization in the West in the 18th, 17th, 18th centuries, and so on. The seventh dimension of culture is transmission mechanisms. So we are seeing, for example, in the Indian context, the key insight is knowledge has survived through thousands of years despite so many invasions, destruction of libraries, killing of scholars, and colonial era suppression, and so on. Our knowledge has survived all of these things. How? Why? Because of the mechanisms that our civilization, our culture has evolved. For example, the Guru Sishya Parampara, the sacred teacher disciple lineage is transmitting knowledge orally with unbroken fidelity across thousands of years. Vedangas, six auxiliary disciplines preserving correct recitation of Vedic phonetics, Siksha, Chandas, Vyakarna, Nirukta, Kalpa, Jyotisha. Our samskaras and rituals, these are life cycle rites, whether at marriage, birth, and so many samskaras that we had in the past. We have fewer today, but in the past we had many, many more, serving as experiential learning. Cultural memory is embodied in practice rather than formal instruction. So we are seeing the practices themselves are reinforcing these knowledge systems. Our festivals and performances, annual cycles of festivals encode astronomy, ecology, stories, ethics into participatory community experience. There's a decentralization of knowledge because distributed across families, guilds, temples, matas, all of them survived because there's no single point of failure. You had to destroy thousands and thousands and thousands of temples across the country if you wanted to destroy Sanatana Dharma. And the fact that we had oral tradition, we had precise memorization through structured oral transmission, entirely reliable even without written texts for millennia. And this explains this why the knowledge has survived through so many millennia. Then we can look at the eighth cultural dimension, and this is collective memory, our itihasas and puranas. And the key insight over here is that civilizational databases are encoded in narrative form. So we are seeing our texts are not mythology as they are positioned in Western texts. They are encoded repositories of genealogies, dynastic histories, astronomical calendars, timekeeping, ethical governance frameworks, medical, ecological knowledge, mathematical, scientific principles, geographic, navigational data, philosophical and metaphysical systems, performing arts, and cultural practices. The key insight is Indian culture preserves collective memory in narratives that must be decoded to reveal their rigorous encoded meanings. So this decentralized practice made the Indian civilization robust despite invasions and foreign attacks. The Puranas are veritably encyclopedias. These are encyclopedias of knowledge that the Indians have encoded over centuries, living documents that were continually updated and with our knowledge systems. So this too forms the collective memory through itihasas and Puranas. So I've shown to you 8 dimensions of our culture where we see the richness of the Indian culture as a knowledge continuum. So at this point, we can now take a slightly different route. We can see where did this deracination of our culture take place, where we have been removed from the cultural context of our civilization, how Western devastation of Indian culture took root. In order to do that, we have to see how the West defines its own culture. We see that the West today, when they define Western culture, they start with the Greco Roman period because that's the only period in the past where they had some rationalism, a period of time when Greeks had strong contact with India, the philosopher period, and they learned so many philosophies and ways of looking at truth from Indians. So we are seeing in this kind of rationalism, logic and empirical sciences are the root of all knowledge, not different from Vaisheshika, for example. Greek philosophy was exalted by the Westerners as the origin of civilization. Even today, if you take any Western book on the history of science, they will obligatorily go to Greek as a source. Some father of atomic thing, father of medicine, father of physics, everything is traced back to Greece for them. So it is the origin of civilization. So we also observe in the Greco rationalism, we are seeing rational inquiry was separated from spiritual practice, very similar to how Indian context took place. The Pramanas allowed us to inquire the nature of truth. Science versus religion as an ongoing conflict, and universal templates derived from European experience. In other words, today Europeans take these as as universal. One truth, one God, our ways and our categories are universal to the Europeans. Now, the next important thing for the West is Abrahamic theology. The Roman Empire adopted Christianity in 330 current era and promptly fell into dark ages. In the Abrahamic theology, we are seeing linear time. There's a creation event, there is history that arises from that, and there's an apocalypse, an end event. Morality is divine commands. God has commanded them to do something, and morality derives from those commands. They claim absolute truths because these are truths from God that cannot be erased or changed. They have notions of sin, salvation, and chosen people. They have monotheistic absolutism, one God, one truth, and so on. And because of these, they cannot coexist with science. So today we see secular religious divide has been institutionalized. So we are seeing that they have imposed their ways, their culture on the rest of the world, saying their categories are universal and we will study other civilizations with ours as a benchmark. That is how Europeans have studied Indian culture in addition. So Western culture separates religion from science, where culture is seen as human expression, behavior, symbols, social organization, not as a knowledge system. Whereas in the Bharatiya system, no, we are seeing culture as a knowledge continuum, but they have removed knowledge from culture, making it unable to recognize Indic knowledge systems in its own terms because of their own separations, because their systems are incompatible. One God, one truth, our ways, and such things are incompatible with science. So they have had to separate out culture and science. And because of that, they cannot see Indian systems for what they are. So the damage and deracination is enormous due to this Western universalism. They're exalting their systems as the only way to study every other culture. We see, for example, colonial voices on Indian knowledge. James Mill, who reduced Hindu rituals as grossest superstition, absurd, frivolous. Macaulay, we know about him, who said a single shelf of a good European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Max Muller, who said mythology is a disease of language, rejecting metaphysical symbolism that is there in Vedic literature. Monier Williams, who saw idolatry as a very life and soul of Hinduism, iconoclastic theological rejection. What did all these things result in? This way of looking at Indian civilization, as well as the development of linguistics and trying to seek a homeland for the Proto-Indo-Europeans, this led to this enormous harm to the Indian civilization. It led to the so-called Aryan invasion, today's become migration theory, which inserted race as a driver of social stratification. The Europeans had a class system. They had something called casta. They imposed it on the existing mobile Jati Varna system as a hierarchical, immobile caste system. Our Vedic culture was framed as mythology, superstition, idolatry, primitive rituals. So these categories were institutionalized in the Western systems, and unfortunately, after Nehruvian socialism took root in India and later Marxist, we are seeing these institutionalized in Indian education as well. Generations of Indians who are educated today, they are educated to see civilizational inheritance through these bigoted Western lenses. They have forced a compartmentalization, whereas Indian knowledge has been deeply embedded in our culture. That's why I call it a knowledge continuum. They have forced a compartmentalization. They see yoga removed from the spiritual context, removed from the notion of your connection with Brahman. They remove that, away from that, and see it as fitness. Yoga, Ayurveda, instead of seeing the holistic way of system medicine, which sees through ecology and other things, it is seen as alternative medicine today. Vedanta is seen as abstract philosophy. All our symbols have been stripped of the metaphoric, multi-layered meanings that we have. It has been reduced to myth. It has been reduced taking literal meanings out of these things. What has it resulted in? Very, very unfortunately, today we see civilizational insecurity in Hindus needing Western validation and embarrassment about cultural symbols. So, with that, I'd like to have a positive note here. There is a strength to the Bharatiya civilization. We have a resilient Indian culture. So, we can study the resilience of Vedic culture in three dimensions. The key insight is these three dimensions are not independent, they are a knowledge continuum, which is the Karma Kanda, Upasana Kanda, and the Jnana Kanda. The Karma Kanda we know is a ritual and procedural dimension with cosmic truths encoding astronomical timing, ecological principles, metaphysical notions of self transformation, and conduct refined through practice, and yamas and niyamas as ethical preparation. All of these are part of our karma kanda with deep rituals and procedures and so on. Upasana kanda, which is contemplative worship. So this has meant an internalization of symbolic meaning, contemplative identification with the cosmos. For example, there are notions in a divinity, my Ishta Devata, that I wish to see reflected in myself. Those are the contemplative identification that we have. And it enhances meditative depth when we do focused upasana. It bridges karma jnana and it strengthens the inquiring mind. The Jnana Kanda is insight and ultimate reality, is a direct experience of Brahman or Paravidya. It illuminates the meaning of rituals. So it is Vedic insight, basically Paravidya, which is greater than Aparavidya, for example, as Brihadaranyaka Upanishad says that. It transforms habit into awareness. It makes culture truly transformative. So the key insight here is each dimension supports the other two. This is the beauty and the depth of the Vedic civilization. We can ask a very important question today that we have got so much of deracination. Our jnana is gone, wisdom is gone. What happens when jnana resides? What is the consequence of lost knowledge? Well, karma becomes transactional. Our rituals have been reduced today to bargaining with a deity, that I will perform a ritual, therefore I must obtain a reward. Or worse, today our rituals have collapsed into superstition. It's abandoned entirely. Our upasanas become begging, supplication. Contemplative identification is replaced by petitioning the deity. Where the meditative depth is lost, and deity is seen as an external wish fulfiller. So unfortunate. Our procedures have rigidified because after karmas become transactional, procedural authority loses sight of understanding. Jnana is gone. We don't know why we are doing those rituals, which means rigid injunctions are replaced the spirit of inquiry and learning. Our symbols have become opaque. The Murti Puja that we do, instead of becoming contemplative upasana, it has become idolatry. Symbolic literacy has been lost. Rituals seem irrational without knowledge of their meaning. So today, the drivers of jnana laws are urbanization, where the joint family is gone, then the intergenerational transfer of knowledge is gone, the modern schooling that deracinates our youth, public secularization, where we cannot practice our festivals or any such thing in public, the deracination that enormous numbers of people are carrying, and the loss of extended family. This is the reason why today we continue to lose jnana. So I said that we are a resilient culture. We have survived despite the loss of jnana. How is that possible? I outlined the decentralized nature of knowledge that helps in understanding these things. But we also have an inner strength of the Vedic culture which preserved the flame through the darkest periods that we have. Our rituals are decentralized. Karma Kanda survived invasions as a memory storage device, not dependent on any single institution or text. Even though the knowledge was gone, we continue to perform the rituals blindly today, but it is a memory storage device because it is waiting to be illuminated by jnana. Vedangas, they set precise phonetic rules, ensured correct recitation of Vedas across thousands of years without written aids. Even if the libraries are burnt, they continued. Cultural embodiment, our knowledge was there. Knowledge is embodied in festivals, cuisine, architecture, daily practice, invisible but powerful. Temple liturgies, our individual and community worship safeguarded our mantras, even as that philosophical literacy was weakened. Oral precision through the padas, krama, jata, jnanapata, these guaranteed error-free transmission across generations, and decentralization that I said earlier, because distributed knowledge, single attacks could not erase a civilizational memory. So the key insight we take away here is the preservation of karma and upasana has kept the door open for a resurgence of jnana. Very important to understand that. Today we try to minimize rituals as superstition and so on without understanding the value it has got through history. It has preserved the structure, the skeleton of this continuum of knowledge systems that we can illuminate with jnana. So we have contemporary influences today. There's a cultural vacuum that has been filled by these things. Cinema-driven neocultures. Studio imagined culture, for example, this fills the vacuum left by laws of jnana. Cinematic rituals, symbols adopted as tradition. We are seeing that today. Market-driven spectacles, these are what movies are. They have replaced civilizational fidelity. Bollywood has become an imperfect bridge for the diaspora because that is their first exposure to festivals, whether Diwali, Holi, and other such things, including language. So, emotional narrative that is there in movies has replaced metaphysical meaning. Cinematic extravaganza weddings have become aspiration templates for our youth. And foreign culture raping. We are seeing demotion of Hindu deities and rituals because it is presented as superstitions. We are seeing foreign practices adopted as aspiration goals for our youth. Social adoption of behaviors are depicted in foreign media, and cultural normalization of alien practices. We are seeing deracinated communities adopting foreign identities, and second generation diasporas completely disconnected from the roots. So the key distinction is Vedic culture embeds metaphysical meaning. Cinematic or alien culture exalts visual forms without metaphysical depth. very important. We said culture is dynamic, and yes, it is changing today thanks to these neo influences because Jnana is gone. That culture vacuum has been filled with these contemporary influences. But here is a distinction. These are extravaganzas meant for market forces, right? To sell in the marketplace, but they don't have metaphysical meaning. So, if we want to strengthen our culture, what is the path to decolonization? Decolonization means recovery of knowledge frameworks, not political agitation. We have to reframe rituals. We have to see rituals as enacting civilization memory, not as inherited superstition. We have to identify ignorance of structure and meaning as a real problem. Reconnect with the three dimensions karma kanda to preserve practice of discipline, upasana kanda teach symbolic interpretation, contemplation, jnana kanda study primary text and commentaries. Symbolic literature, if temple visits should serve to learn and teach encoded metaphors, festivals for astronomy, cycle symbolism, mantras, exercise and contemplation and meditation, learning of Sanskrit to regain sovereignty to interpret our own texts, avoiding reliance on distorted Western translations and direct access to primary sources. Recovery requires teaching ourselves and the next generation why Murti Puja is meditation and not idolatry. The intellectual reconnection requires integrating practice with inquiry, reclaiming Indian science and philosophy out of the secular religious split that has been imposed by Western paradigms, how festivals or Ayurveda and ecology, mathematics and music, Sanskrit epistemology. I've talked about these things. So the key insight is reintegrating practice with inquiry. This transforms cultural habit into a living, meaningful awareness. So once we have knowledge coming in, our practices that are seen as superstitions or traditions and these kinds of things, they become a meaningful, living, civilizational awareness. So, what is the role of institutions in this cultural resurgence? Well, we can see organizations like Chinmaya Mission and others, they play a key role in recovery of knowledge systems. So the matas, they revive Guru Sishya transmission. Temples should be seen as centers of symbolic literature, literacy education. Gurukulas, holistic Indic education systems. Vedic recitation schools preserving the traditions. Modern organizations like Chinmaya Mission should integrate Vedanta with daily life. Hindu universities like HUA, where we do academic study of Indian knowledge systems. Cultural foundations should fund primary research into these things. Study circles, whether individual or clubs that are formed to study Vedanta and so on, these are grassroots philosophical inquiry. The family itself and community, we should see daily rituals and practice of at home, community practice of festivals, shared cultural memory, parent child transmission of symbolic meanings, and diaspora communities should preserve their cultural identity. So we should see disciplined scholarship with humility, avoiding self dismissal and uncritical glorification. This allows true recovery. So we avoid the true extremes. Both of these are extremes. In one extreme, we have self dismissal because we have internalized the Western notions, their colonial Western critique as a truth. We have embarrassment about our visible cultural symbols, weak defenses, justification for our practice, outright rejection of Hindu identity, needing Western validation before accepting Indian knowledge systems, seeing rituals as primitive superstition. On the other extreme, we have got uncritical glorification. We have got overcompensation through reactionary assertion, replacing analysis with slogans, uncritical social media forwards without scholarship. How many of us have seen WhatsApp university kind of messages talking utter nonsense that is passed off over here, making extravagant, unverified claims, defensiveness rather than scholarly engagement, glorification without understanding. We are not that. We are a knowledge based civilization. There is a middle path, disciplined scholarship with humility, evidence based understanding, as I've shown in so many of my talks, that we have evidence based understanding of our history. This allows true cultural recovery. In conclusion, the Indian culture can be seen as a knowledge continuum. Our knowledge centric civilization, Indian culture is not folklore. It is a rich, coherent knowledge system integrating science, ethics, arts, cosmology across millennia. We need to have decolonized methodology, viewing our culture through Indic lenses and not Western lenses. This allows us a less subjective and a more rigorous evidence-based understanding of our own culture. Resilience through decentralization. We survived invasions, cultural assaults, because it was decentralized knowledge through families, guilds, mathas, and temples. And the path to resurgence is to revive jnana, while honoring karma and upasana khandas. Jnana is the path to a meaningful, transformative expression of Vedic identity. The key takeaway: culture is knowledge plus worldview plus practice, sustained, transmitted, evolved across many centuries. So, my call to action and concluding insight: our rituals have preserved the cultural core of a civilization's knowledge systems despite all assaults. Infusion of jnana enriches the karma and upasana khanda. It creates a coherent, transformative cultural framework. This enrichment will dissolve the embarrassment of avidya, of ignorance, with the clarity of understanding. India is a living, knowledge centric civilization, not a relic of the past. So, my call is, please participate in your culture with awareness, recover symbolic literacy, revive jnana, recognize India's civilizational identity. So we can say tamasoma jyotirgamaya. Lead me from darkness to light. Thank you very much for listening to my talk and for your support of our activities.